Welcome to Module 1. What would I be getting myself into? I'm adoption coach Sally Ankerfeld, and I will be guiding you through this module. I will be using the benefit of my own experience of adoption. I have adopted 3 children, the first through an international adoption, the second through an open adoption, and the third through foster care. I do remember way back when I was first thinking about adopting a child. I asked myself, what is adoption all about? What does it entail? What would I be getting myself into? In this first module, we will be exploring that question as we begin the journey of discernment. I look forward to journeying with you.
When it comes to having kids, there is a common belief that family is family no matter how that family was formed, and that the decision to create a family or to add to a family can be made quickly. When my husband and I began to struggle with infertility, we shared it with several close friends. We heard more than once, "Well, you can always just adopt." That word just makes it sound so easy, as if there was no big preparation or research needed before you could make the decision. And this is the thing, my husband and I were actually believing this as well. But this truly is a false impression. I am here to tell you that adoption is one of those big decisions that needs research. It needs thought and planning. It is a big choice that has a lifelong impact on not only your life, but the life of the child and the life of the birth family. So the more you know at this stage in the game, the better. It is helpful to begin the decision-making process with that big question, why? Why am I pondering adopting a child? Some reasons might be easier to identify than others. Maybe one of your reasons would be one that, like I mentioned before, my husband and I had, which was infertility issues. For others, it might be avoiding pregnancy complications or concerns about passing down genetic disorders. Maybe some of you are in a same-sex couple relationship and want to create a family. Or maybe you are a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle who has a family member who is unable to raise their child at this time. Some of you may also have a faith that is encouraging you and tugging at your heart to adopt. Maybe there's just that feeling in your heart that you want to make a difference somehow in this world, and perhaps it could be by helping a child in need. Or maybe there's no real specific reason at this time. Knowing your why can help you discern if the question of adopting a child is one that came from inside of you or one that is coming from outside of you. In other words, something that is coming from other people's hopes and expectations for you. The truth is that adoption is not a good fit for everyone. Like many things in life, adoption is one such thing where special skills and qualities and characteristics are necessary so that the adoptive family, but especially that adoptive child, can have that best environment for thriving. In this module and in future modules, we will be giving you solid information to help you decide if adopting a child is a good fit for you. Finding out before you adopt is so much better for the child and for you. So let's begin with getting clear about what adoption is legally, because there are some confusing messages out there. Adoption is the legal process by which the parental rights and the responsibility for a child is permanently transferred from one person to another. This process can be a voluntary one where an expectant mother reaches out to an adoption agency, for example. Then the expectant mother gives birth, and then she places her child for adoption through the court system, and she states that she willfully is ending her right to parent. or this transfer of the rights of parenting can occur when the courts themselves end a parent's rights, which is most often very devastating for that parent. However, the process formally ending the person's parental responsibility is called the termination of parental rights. The act of permanently transferring the parental rights and the parenting responsibility to another is called adoption. Should you adopt, you would become the legal parent with all of the rights and the obligations as to this child. Adoption is permanent unless it is disrupted or dissolved, and on rare occasions terminated due to fraud. We'll go into this a little more in Module 6. You know, one thing I had not thought much about when my husband and I adopted our first child were the things that do not get terminated through adoption. Even though a child's first mother or father no longer have the right to parent, they always will be my child's first family. That can never be taken away, nor would I want it to be taken away. The same applies to my child's first culture. That will always be with them. This remains true despite the legal process that terminates the first family's rights and obligations. Understanding the legal process of adoption is helpful when it comes to one very common question. Can my child's birth mother come back or change her mind? This is virtually impossible legally, not to mention the fact that most expectant mothers do not make an adoption decision without very careful thought and pain. It is a difficult decision and full of many emotions, including loss, sadness, and most likely guilt and shame. We have come a long ways in understanding that most often an open adoption is best for the child. So what is an open adoption? This does not mean that adoptive parents co-parent with first mothers or fathers. It means that the adoptive family and the birth mother or the birth family are all focused on the best interest of the child whom they all love. It may or may not include physical contact. Ideally, an open adoption includes emotional openness. To learn more about the benefits and challenges of open adoption, I encourage you to read Lori Holden's book, The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption. Currently, almost all adoptions are open to some degree. It is important to know that many expectant mothers who are considering placing their child for adoption have some degree of openness listed as a factor in their decision to opt for adoption. While open adoption agreements are not legally binding in most states, adoptive parents are ethically bound to make every effort to sustain an open adoption relationship. Contact can be on a continuum, from very little to lots. For instance, communication can range from sending a photograph or a letter here and there during the year or on special occasions, to an agreement to meet regularly, and perhaps might include phone calls, joint holiday and or family events. While this may sound startling at first, many of us have probably experienced a similar blending of families, either through a remarriage that joins two families that include children, or just blending two families together in partnerships. What most people call a closed adoption is currently known as a traditional adoption. Because of the availability of information on the internet, the availability of DNA testing, and because most women who choose adoption for their child want to continue some degree of contact, practically speaking, traditional adoption no longer exists. I have also learned personally that it was inaccurate for me to expect that adopting internationally, for instance, would erase the first parent's presence in my child's life. In fact, I have found that my child's inability to have knowledge and or contact often causes them deep emotional pain. So whether mentioned or unmentioned, whether physically present or not, when people adopt a child, their family, their first family, comes with them, not only in their biology and who they are as a person, but also in their hearts and minds. They think about this first family. This is true even in cases of international adoption where actual contact may be unlikely and or impossible, and it's also true even with adopting an infant where there may not be a physical memory of that person. So open or closed is a decision made by the first mother. It's not the social worker's decision or the prospective adoptive parent's decision. It is wise to think about what type of relationship you could handle. If you ask for a closed adoption, it will most likely make it more difficult to adopt. And as I mentioned, the views on adoption have changed through the years, and more so now than ever. Adoption is about finding families for children and not about finding children for parents. This is because we now know that in most cases, contact with first families is healthier than no contact at all. Now that we have discussed the distinction between open and closed adoptions, I want to introduce you to 4 basic types of adoption: infant adoption, adopting from foster care, fostering to adopt, and I want to briefly mention here that kinship adoption could include step-parent adoption, which most often has different dynamics than kinship adoption that we will be discussing here. When people think of adopting a baby, most people think of a newborn, but it could also mean a child who is somewhat older than a newborn. For instance, a child who is 12, 15, 16 months old. Some people's decision to adopt or not can be greatly influenced by how much of a chance they have to receive an infant. Please refer to the references at the end of this module for current statistics. Generally speaking, fewer and fewer infant adoptions are occurring each year. It is surmised that this is due to a combination of factors. Teen pregnancies have decreased. There is more societal acceptance of pregnancy outside of wedlock. International adoptions are fewer because countries are encouraging and locating adoptive families within their own countries. These are all trends that have a great chance of benefiting the child, and they mean that fewer infants may be available for adoption. Since the number of children in need of adoption is declining, especially infants, some people are turning to foster care in hopes that an infant or toddler they would be fostering may eventually be in need of a permanent home. Viewing foster care, especially fostering an infant in this way, as an avenue to adoption, this can be in direct conflict with the purpose of foster care, which is to provide a safe home for a child while their parents work on stability or health. Unless the parents' parental rights have been terminated, there is a strong possibility that the child will be reunited with their parents. A child could be with you for a few months or longer before they can be reunited with the family. That being said, many states do have foster to adopt programs where the children in need of foster care have a family situation where the termination of parental rights is likely to occur. With these programs, your intentions to adopt would be a prerequisite to being a part of the program. Even then, there is no guarantee. So here's the bottom line. If you were to become a foster parent in hopes of adopting the child, you would have to have the mindset that this child may not become available for you to adopt. It takes a unique person to be able to love a child unconditionally with the knowledge that the child may not be in their home forever. You would need to be able to share your foster child with their family. You would need to be flexible, like making sure your foster child is available for parental visits. You would want to be prepared for your foster child going home for a weekend or a week-long visit. And you would want to be open to relating to the child's first family. It would be important not to judge the parent's situation, as that would get very painful and very messy for everybody, but most especially for the child. An avenue for adopting is also through foster care. Adopting a waiting child, by the way, when we say waiting child, we mean a child who's available for adoption because the parental rights have been terminated or are in the process of being terminated. To give you a picture of those children and who they are, we can say that they are most likely, on the average, 7.5 years old, which is our newest statistic in the year 2021. And they are from a variety of racial backgrounds. Some children who are part of that average actually are over the age of 12. In fact, 6,000 children over the age of 12 were adopted. And of those 6,000 children, 127 of those were over the age 18. It's interesting to note that more than 25,000 teens were still waiting to be adopted at the end of 2021. As you hear these numbers, perhaps you can surmise that children in foster care have a very difficult road. There is some kind of trauma involved for the child to be in the foster care system in the first place. And many of these children also face losses and confusion as they go along in their years, when they might be moved from one foster care home to another, and maybe even to another or another. Some children are living in institutional care settings. Can you imagine what a child may have gone through to add to that uncertainty? And perhaps think of the years of not knowing when or if you would be able to go home. If you were to adopt a child from care, you would need the primary qualities of steadfastness and patience. What about adopting a sibling group? Well, in most cases, it is important that siblings stay together, and that most likely would be a goal of an adoption social worker who is working in the foster care system. If you are presented with the choice of adopting a sibling group, consider it very carefully. What are the ramifications for your life? Some questions to ask yourself would be, would you have enough resources? Would you have enough time and energy and financial support to accommodate more than one child? And more than one child arriving all at once. Now, there are some rare cases where it is considered healthier to separate the siblings, as long as they can be assured of contact. One example is when one of the siblings, most likely the oldest child, has taken on a parent role within the sibling group, and the social workers may feel like that child could benefit from being able to be a child, and so they may separate a sibling group for those reasons. Whatever the case is, the social workers most likely will ask you to make a commitment to making sure that your child is in contact with his or her siblings. This is a promise and an added layer that would be expected of you as an adoptive parent. Adopting a child who experiences challenges. We use the word challenges here, but it's otherwise referred to as special needs. No matter what you call it, these children face challenges, and you, as their parent, would face challenges beyond what is quote unquote normally expected or required. Would you have the energy, patience, and financial resources to cope? Would you have reliable and extensive support systems that could assist you? Challenges cover several circumstances. Medical issues, for example, these might be temporary, like a needed surgery, or something lifelong, like diabetes or Down syndrome. Should you decide to adopt, you would at some point in the adoption process need to fill out a lengthy form that asks what you'd be willing to consider in terms of the physical, emotional, behavioral, and medical challenges a child may have. It's important to be honest with yourself and others about whether you can manage any of these special situations. You would want to ensure that your mind and heart have an equal voice in deciding what you can handle. It's not in the best interest of the child to discover later on that it's too much for you to handle. This after a child has been placed in your home, it would be disastrous for them and for you. For emotional challenges, if you decide to adopt an older child, you would want to have a complete and accurate information about their emotional challenges and their behavioral challenges and any trauma that they may have experienced. Before you commit, have all the information as possible. Ask several times about this with your social worker. Is there any more? Because knowledge is power. Behavioral challenges can be seen even in babies, like failing to make eye contact. This small challenge at the beginning of life can lead to larger challenges later on. As for older children, behavioral challenges might be easier to identify, like maybe they show up in social interactions at school. But the same holds true for emotional challenges and behavioral challenges, that we look closely at what the child is expressing. Learning issues also can show up later rather than earlier, because when a child is younger, learning does not require as much physical or critical thinking or long attention spans. But then right around grade 3, you might start to see the child having learning challenges in, say, math, for example. And the medical challenges which we covered in the previous slide are always important to consider, and having a doctor look over the medical challenges that this child may be experiencing. There are other important considerations. Religion can be an additional layer to integrate into your family, more so with an older child who has already identified with a particular religion. Although I will say with one of my children who was adopted as an infant, their religion of birth became important to them as they grew older. A child may be from a different culture. That's another factor that plays out into the future. How would you acknowledge that culture as your child grows? My husband and I adopted 3 children of another race, and we are white. I can tell you firsthand that being raised by parents outside of one's race and culture is not easy for children. If you would be raising a child of another race, it is imperative to know that you would become a multiracial family, and that would call on you to make major changes for the sake of your child, such as moving to a diverse community if you are not already in one, or expanding your friendship network to include a diverse group of people. As you are discerning whether or not adopting a child is right for you, there are some current trends we think you might want to know about. First of all, adoptions are decreasing in general, but infant adoptions in particular. Professionals from the field report fewer expectant parents requesting adoption counseling and fewer placements being made with involvement by agencies and attorneys. The numbers support the claims. Let's just take 2016, for example. 2.2% of adoptions were infants under age 1. That's only 2%. 12.3% were 1 year old, and 14.1% were 2 years old. These percentages can vary widely from state to state. That's an average. For instance, the highest percent of adoptions under the age of 1 occurred in Utah with 11.4%, but New Mexico and Montana had no adoptions of children under age 1. We are learning more and more also about the trauma inherent in adoption. Science has given us a better understanding of trauma and how it affects our brains, and that includes the trauma of loss that all adoptees experience. We are seeing also a trend of stricter requirements and uniform practices, like requiring a home study for all prospective adoptive parents. That helps assure that parents are prepared for adoption. Through education, we also see prospective adoptive parents being better able and prepared to parent. Another trend is that diversity in the makeup of families is expanding. We see more single-parent adoptive families, we see transracial families, and same-sex couples. The trend of the adoptees, where their concerns are now voiced and being heard, is wonderful to see, such as the right to have an original birth certificate. We also are noticing that the popularity of DNA testing has helped some adoptees whose adoptions originally were closed or who had no or little knowledge of their first families now being able to access and have knowledge of their families. Because open adoptions are more the rule than the exception, adoptees are able to have more interactions and relationships with their birth families, which is another promising trend. If you choose to adopt in the United States, it's called a domestic adoption. Here we have highlighted the 3 paths to adoption in the U.S.: public, private, and independent. Each state has its own laws governing adoption, but there are many similarities between them. For example, an adoption cannot take place without the termination of parental rights. If you were to adopt a child from another state, there is also something called the Interstate Compact, which requires compliance with the laws of the adoptive parent's own state and of the sending state where the child lives. The state path is through your state's Department of Child Welfare or Child Services, and there you will likely find adoption through foster care programs, special needs programs, waiting children, all the ones we discussed previously. Lots of people who provide adoption-related services like facilitators and online matching companies are not licensed. They don't have to go through a state government's rigorous vetting process. In an independent adoption, where there is no involvement of adoption professionals, there is more risk for both the expectant mother and the adoptive parent. Since there may be less oversight and a lack of understanding of the rules and laws, people handling independent adoptions may cross the lines of the state laws that prohibit specific types of support to the expectant mother. This may persuade the expectant mother to place her child for adoption. And it also can make the expectant mother vulnerable in her time of need and uncertainty when she sees what is being offered to her. The expectant mother is at risk, also because she often doesn't get adequate counseling before adoption. So both the unethical practices and the lack of education raise the possibility that a mother may change her mind. This puts the adoptive parents at risk as well, emotionally and possibly financially. Often adoptive parents may have had little education as well as to the lifetime ramifications of adopting. Most importantly, the child's well-being is at risk when first mothers and prospective adoptive parents do not have adequate adoption education. As I mentioned earlier, international adoption is decreasing significantly. This is because countries are encouraging adoption in their own country. They are recognizing the benefits to the child. Another reason is concern over the predatory possibilities of adoption. Even so, some families in the United States look towards international adoption for building their families. They may choose it for a variety of reasons. It may be less expensive depending on what kind of adoption you are comparing it to in the United States. Sometimes more children are waiting to be placed from a particular country for some reason, oftentimes for medical reasons. Sometimes the prospective parents were closed out of domestic adoptions and also then want to look towards other avenues. Some adoptive parents want to make a point about having a closed adoption, and they see international adoption as having more possibilities of having the adoption be closed. We do know, however, that adoptions, even international adoptions, are never fully closed because for our children, their first families always exist in their minds and in their hearts. For the health and well-being of children, countries are seeing the importance of promoting adoption within their own country instead of allowing adoptions to take place outside of their country. Some long-established entities, like Bethany Christian Services, no longer facilitate international adoption. International adoption numbers have plummeted in recent years. Some countries change their policies from time to time. For example, in the past, Ukraine announced no out-of-country adoptions unless there is a health or medical issue for younger children, or if the child is 6 years old or older. It is essential that you look up and follow the latest changes and guidelines. Compliance with the Hague Convention, which is the protection for the child against child trafficking, is important for you to consider if you were going to be adopting internationally. Make sure that the agency you're looking at would be in compliance with the Hague Convention. Some agencies have solid relationships with certain countries. Lutheran Social Services, for example, historically has had a solid relationship with the Philippines. This can help to ensure that the children truly need homes. In every module, we will feature some insights from our colleague, Sharon Butler Obaze. As we mentioned earlier, she is an adult adoptee. Her insights offer a personal and valuable perspective for you to consider as you are thinking about whether or not to adopt a child. The next 3 slides are Sharon's words. Close your eyes and think about yourself as a child. Imagine the special person who provided you with care and comforting love. Rest for a moment in that treasured memory. Now, just as you recall the comfort and love you experienced, imagine being expected to erase that special person from your mind and replace them with another person, a stranger. Imagine how that might feel. This replacement is an example of how trauma begins in the psyche of an adopted child. This happens regardless of their background, race, age, and family history. Adoptive parents need to know whatever the child may have missed is ever present in their hearts and minds. Adoption is trauma. I realize that is a brutal and unwavering statement. If you decide to adopt, whether it be a baby, a child, or a young adult, they have experienced life-altering changes. It's important to recognize this. These were the words of Sharon. We would like to leave you with some closing thoughts from each of us 4 coaches. Sally says, "The one most affected by our decisions and actions is a child." Sharon wants us to remember, please do your personal work first. Susan points out, a thinking of a child as a gift from an expectant mother can depersonalize and commodify both child and mother. And Gail says, open adoptions, while not legally enforceable, carry an ethical and moral responsibility. And now we invite you to dig deeper. Take some time, either now or a little later on after you have had some time to digest the material, and answer these questions. We invite you to write them down in a notebook so you can keep track of your thoughts and your progress. After learning more about the details of adoption, what are you thinking about the most? What aspect of adoption surprised you the most, and why? If you were to adopt a child, which aspect of adoption would be the most challenging for you, and why? In our next module, we will cover the question, what would be required of me? We will become acquainted with the elements of a home study and discover essential intangible qualities every adoptive parent would need. Please note also these references for your use. Congratulations on completing Module 1. We are excited to have you join us for Module 2, where Gail Swift will guide you through the question, what would be required of me?